Our first speaker today is Alice Kessler-Harris. She is the R. Gordon Hoxsey Professor of American History at Columbia University and Professor in the Institute for Research on Women and Gender. Kessler-Harris specializes in the history of American labor and the comparative and interdisciplinary exploration of women and gender. Her books include In Pursuit of Equity, Women, Men, and the Quest for Economic Citizenship in 20th Century America. Out to Work, a history of wage-earning women in the United States. A Women's Wage, Historical Meanings and Social Consequences. And Women Have Always Worked, a historical overview. She is co-editor of Protecting Women, Labor Legislation in Europe, Australia, and the United States, and U.S. History as Women's History. Her most recent book, Gendering Labor History, contains her essay on women's work and social policy. Welcome, Alice.
Thank you. I want you to know this is a historic occasion. It's the first time that K for Kessler-Harris has ever been the first in the alphabet instead of, I mean, usually I'm somewhere in the indistinguishable middle, so I'm happy to be number one for a change. I'm also very happy to be here today, and I take my 10-minute role. We've each been given 10 minutes for a presentation. I wouldn't want to call it representative, but as I look around the room and as I look at my fellow panel members, I think each of us could spend 10 hours, not 10 minutes, talking about the legacy of the Bush-Cheney administration, and that legacy of the administration is something that all of us as historians and as professionals and as citizens have been thinking about at least since Barack Obama was elected president. So what I'm going to do is not try to cover everything, which I think would be impossible, but to offer you a couple of suggestions, ways of provoking and thinking about the legacy of the Bush-Cheney administration in the hope that we will all talk together after the presentations are over. So where to begin with this? What I want to do is begin by saying that as I sit back and think about the legacy in relationship to my own sense of self as a historian and what I particularly can say about it, I think that much of my work as a historian has had to do with the role of ideology, of ideas in shaping people's movements and people's actions, people's relationship to their lives and their politics. And I think we can think about the Bush-Cheney administration, the last 8 years, in the same kinds of ideological terms, and that perhaps doing so might help us frame the kinds of things that have come out of the administration. So I think what I want to do is to present to you 3 arenas in which ideology has functioned, has left a legacy for us, most of it negative, although I do have to say that out of it, in dialectical fashion, I believe, will grow some of the seeds of what might well be a positive response in the years to come. First, ideological legacy, the idea and the practice of terror. I open up the subject of terror because I think the construction of terrorism in the last 8 years, and particularly since 9/11, has been a new and elusive concept, a concept that has been wielded, deployed, used, manipulated, and ingrained in our consciousnesses in exactly the same way that the concept of communism, not the state as it functioned as a communist state, but the idea of communism as an enemy was ingrained in our consciousnesses. Indeed, I'd say that given the end of the Cold War, terrorism may now be the new communism, if you like. That idea of terrorism, whatever it means, has made possible a range of behaviors, including the doctrine of preemptive war, which I think will have a long-standing legacy, the resort to the military to solve problems before resorting to diplomatic strategy, America's pursuit of its unilateral interests through military power, and I could go on. But I want to make one special point in this respect, which was actually made for me by my friend Sarah Shields this morning, who said that what it has enabled us to do is to negate the human costs of war. That because in the interests of fighting terror, we feel as though we are fighting for our own self-interest. We therefore deny and decry, as we did, for example, in the war in Vietnam, the human costs of the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the numbers of refugees, the women and children without means of support, and certainly without means of male support, and so on. I'm still on the idea of terror, which I think also produces the idea of unending war, a war which has neither beginning nor end. It has no locatable geographical source, and it can therefore be utilized as an idea that moves people to act in the name of patriotism in a variety of ways. In the name of war, the war on terror, we have created this abomination that we call homeland security, another idea which has implications in practice, but an idea whose consequences are nothing short of horrifying. An idea in whose name we, the United States, has wiretapped, has violated the liberties of civilians, of American citizen civilians, as well as of non-American citizens, has turned over what should be civilian prosecutions to the military, has violated wholesale acts of secrecy, or has extended acts of secrecy to places where they never belong, has created the category of secrets to defend the United States against being called to account for these activities, has challenged access to the courts for hundreds, if not thousands, of people. All that in the name of the idea of Homeland Security, which is meant to fight the idea of terrorism, whatever that is. And finally, the idea of terrorism has produced an absence of accountability. I don't know what better way to say that, but that is, it has produced a situation where there is nobody to hold responsible. That when we turn to Cheney, when we turn to Bush and say, you know, ought we not to impeach these people for criminal activities, the answer is they are protecting us, right? They are defending us against terrorism. Don't we all want to be protected against it? So that idea, the first idea. Second idea. Now, this one is a little more complicated, and here I want to talk about the ideology of free markets and what that has meant in the last 8 years. Now, I only have 2 more minutes. Oh, God.
Sorry.
Okay, I'll have to negotiate, but okay. The ideology of free markets. Now, we all know that the ideology of free markets was not initiated in this administration. Indeed, it's probably a function of the last 20 or 25 years or so, probably since Ronald Reagan. But that the ideology of market fundamentalism has been put into practice so brutally in the last 8 years that the Bush notion that markets are best left on their own without regulation entirely, as opposed to even the minimal kinds of regulation that a Bill Clinton would have imposed, is an idea which has had severe consequences for this. Now, the most recent consequence, of course, is the current financial catastrophe, but that financial catastrophe has been prefigured by the rising debt and deficit of the last 8 years, and that really was a function of 8 years, by the shift in the language of class, which all of us noticed in the last election, so that nobody anymore talks about working class people. The idea that people are workers is off the table. We are now all middle class, whatever that means in terms of ideas and ideals and aspirations. And finally, in terms of home ownership, again, one of the vehicles that the Bush administration, the Bush-Cheney administration used and fostered to denote the notion that everybody could move into the middle class, a notion which, of course, was belied by the downward spiral in real wages that occurred in exactly the same period that the idea of home ownership was fostered. This ideology of the free market has taken deep roots in American society, so that even now, with an Obama administration faced with the prospect of regulating that market, one still hears echoes of the fact, it's okay to bail out the banks, but is it okay to bail out the automobile industry, for example? Is big government still always bad? Or can big government be imagined sometimes to be good? That is, can we turn to government for good things? And finally, my third point in terms of ideology is the shift that I see in the ideology of, you might call it the ideology of individualism. The sort of increasing and creeping notion over the last 20 years, which reached its apogee in the past 8 years, that the values of democracy, what we used to call democracy, and which we used to think resided in at least some level of collective activity, of social consciousness and care for each other, resides in fact in maximum liberty. So a shift in that notion that individualism could be protected by a kind of hands-off, laissez-faire attitude, as opposed to the New Deal stance and the post-New Deal coalitions, which agreed that individualism and democracy could be best preserved through such programs as Social Security, strong unemployment insurance, and even the extension of social services, including perhaps healthcare. Now, we see in this ideological move a genuine debate. One of the most disappointing things about the Obama campaign to many of us was that Obama could not come out for a healthcare system, which we sometimes call a single-payer system, but for a healthcare system which acknowledged the value of social care for each other, some kind of national insurance system. Instead, he acknowledged the role of the insurance companies and the way in which we have to accommodate those individualistic values. I believe that those values, that shifting sense of what we mean by individualism and individual values, will last a long time. That the idea that everyone has to decide for himself or herself what is good and what is right is an idea that will prevail. And I believe that that idea will have serious consequences, among other things, for women, for the issue of reproductive rights, for the growing sense of inequality in this society, and for the great difficulty we have in fighting the real inequalities that have resulted as a consequence of the last 10 years. So if I had more time, I would tell you what the good seeds of change are that could come out of these, but instead I'm going to let all my fellow panelists depress you even more. Thank you.